Now, Executive Suite with WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi.
Do you remember the Greenhouse Compact? 30 years ago, Ira Magaziner unveiled that ambitious plan to reboot the Rhode Island economy using taxpayer dollars. He had the full-throated support of the state's elite, but not the state's voters. The plan was soundly rejected in a referendum. 3 decades later, our guests this week say Rhode Island can still learn lessons from the Greenhouse Compact and argue the state's economy might be better off if voters had said yes. This week on Executive Suite, we re-examine the Greenhouse Compact with Lou Mazzucchelli and Renn.
Welcome to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi. We're hoping to have Lou Mazzucchelli with us any minute. He's run into a little traffic trouble on the way here, but I am pleased to be joined by Renn, a timely guy. You're from the Midwest. You guys are very punctual, I know, out there.
Thank you. Yes.
You brought that to Rhode Island with you. So it's obviously, we were talking before the break, without Lou, it messes up our format a little here, only because he was here for the Greenhouse Compact, so he was going to bring that historical perspective.
He had a little bit more of the blow-by-blow.
Exactly. He saw it up close. But before we get to any of that, and we're hoping, as I said, Lou will be with us, I want to remind people what the Greenhouse Compact was. Governor Joe Garrahy, the late Governor Garrahy, created the Rhode Island Strategic Development Commission in 1982. And about a year later, there were 69 people involved in making this huge report, and it was 58 chapters. And it called for a whole range of public policy changes, from the estate tax repeal to new sector-specific investments. The cost was estimated about $250 million. We're going to post the full text of the executive summary online at the Executive Suite page on WPRI.com, so you can take a look at it since we'll be talking about it. But the final version of the program was going to go before the voters, and they were going to decide whether to approve it. And former Fleet Bank CEO Terry Murray wrote in that report, "We trust that as the years pass and our Greenhouse Compact takes shape, the people of Rhode Island are able to enjoy greater prosperity as a result of the efforts of the Commission." But those efforts were rejected very soundly by the voters, 80% to 20% rejection of the Greenhouse Compact in the final vote in 1984. So that was the long and storied history of the Greenhouse Compact. It died there in the election in '84, a referendum. Still mentioned constantly. You wrote a column about it recently. You said you hear about it when you get to Rhode Island. I was hearing about it when I first became a business reporter here. It's had a long half-life.
Right. Well, it's amazing that something that was rejected in 1983 is still talked about as if it's current events. It's like when I first heard about it, I'm like, what was the Greenhouse Compact? And I looked it up. That thing was rejected in the 80s.
Right.
And it was a product really of that kind of early 80s called the Volcker recession that really kind of where remember the interest rates were at like 19-20% prime rate, kind of crushed the inflation of the 70s, massive industrial unemployment. So it was really kind of a rough time. And it was ultimately rejected. And though my understanding is this is just one of a very long line of plans going back, maybe even to the 1950s.
The shelves are weighed down, they always say, with these reports. We've done a bunch of them in the last few years. And I think one of the things that's interesting about the report, and you and I both recently have gone back and read it as we look at the problems facing the Rhode Island economy today. And I'll say it's amazing to me how much of it, and I think you feel somewhat similarly, is obviously there's certain parts that are dated. But the overall feeling that Rhode Island had 3 successful economies in the 1700s, the 1800s, and 1900s, and back in the 1600s too, but never developed a 4th one. That's something we still hear today.
Right. I mean, it's true. I was amazed at how relevant a lot of the arguments still were, and a lot of talk about the economy. And I thought it was a really amazing report because actually I've only read the executive summary, which is 47 pages. I mean, the executive summary of this thing is longer than a lot of the full reports that you see issued today. The final one was like 976 pages minimum. I found that there was at least 2 volumes of it. And I mean, there was a remarkably in-depth analysis of the Rhode Island economy with a tremendous amount of data. And remember, this was done at a time when you couldn't just go to the Bureau of Economic Analysis and download their stats from the federal government. There was a lot of number crunching that had to be done here. So it was a tremendous effort. And
I was thinking as I looked at it, to make the charts alone, like that must have been quite a process. No PowerPoint, no Google Drive, no Google Docs.
Right. I mean, so to produce that in that era is really astonishing. And I thought they did an incredibly thorough and I thought very accurate analysis of the economy. If you think about it, they went through.
You see there on the screen we're showing, just so people know, that's, and this might give you a sense of why it got rejected. This is the somewhat ambitious-looking list of which boards and groups would be created and how they would move money around to try to make these investments. People obviously have this innate reaction of concern to giving this much power to whether it's government or even a corporation, maybe state agencies.
Right. Ira went on to design Hillary Care, which was similarly criticized as incredibly baroque and complex and failed for many of the same reasons, probably. And so maybe he didn't learn all of his lessons that he should have. But I think you could certainly, the knock is, the incredible complexity of the analysis that he's famous for probably played a role. It didn't lend itself to incredibly simple narratives to explain it, because it was a very complicated play. And I wouldn't say all aspects of it were really that great, but it appeared to have been constructed also with an eye towards achievability politically, in terms of it didn't want to take too much of an anti-labor or an anti-business or this or that. It tried to balance a lot of things and have a little bit for everybody. So I think it's easy to criticize different pieces of it. But it really was kind of a coherent whole, if you will. And yeah, I think it started from a baseline of highly realistic analysis, including basically interviewing the people involved in every single plant closure that happened in the state and finding, well, why did this plant really close?
And the statistics throughout it, again, are, and I do encourage people to read it, because I think you can still learn a lot about where we are in 2013 in Rhode Island, even from this now 30-year-old report.
Exactly.
I mean, the fact that in 1940, which is the eve of World War II, Rhode Island's per capita income 25% higher than the U.S. average. By 1982, when this was written, 40 years later, it was 7% lower. That's a real loss of I don't know if you'd call it competitive advantage, or just, we had a significant advantage there and just eroding very quickly over 40 years.
Oh yeah, the income situation is pretty bad. If you look at the headline numbers, Rhode Island doesn't look too bad in incomes, but you have to understand we're in a high-cost New England area. So when you adjust that for cost of living, the report that I saw that did that said that the average wages in Metro Providence, which includes the whole state, it ranks something like 47 out of 49 large cities in America, which you factor in that's probably about 25% more expensive than average.
And that's a point people sometimes miss. We talked about that last time you were on the show, how the real wages is the interplay between how much you're paid and then how much the things you get cost. And in Rhode Island, you have the incomes look okay if you were in Texas maybe, but they're not that great when you look at the price of things here.
Yeah. So I think so. And really, if you look at it, the plan was really intended to partially address that by seeking to establish a beachhead in high-wage industries in which Rhode Island, even back then, was not really playing. A lot of the high-value jobs they saw were in sectors that were not going to thrive. They said basically it's going to be eds and meds, and everything else is going to be stagnant to declining. Again, the predictions were extraordinarily accurate.
And that's something, I mean, we were talking with Lou when we were planning the show, who again we're hoping will make it through his traffic jams and such. But the fact is, a lot of the predictions about the future on the economy look very prescient now. If this, and it's not to say the only thing that could have been done was the Greenhouse Compact, but their point was if something isn't done, this is where we're headed, and here's our plan to do something. And this plan wasn't adopted, no major other plan was, and now we're pretty much where they said we'd be.
Yeah, I think on the whole, I mean, you can quibble with some details, but it turned out to be pretty accurate. And I would say also the recommendations, although there's no guarantee they would have been successful, were in many ways remarkably ahead of their time as well. And this, the centerpiece was really this greenhouse concept, which is not really a term that ever came into common currency, but was really sort of a state initiative, kind of a public-private partnership, if you will, to create different research institutions, venture capital funds, kind of marketing booster societies around sectors where it was believed that Rhode Island had some ability to play successfully, in the hopes that this would spawn homegrown industries and not relying on poaching from elsewhere. And frankly, this is pretty much now conventional wisdom. You go to every city and state, they've got some initiative around, say, life sciences. So I'm from Indiana originally. They got something called Bio Crossroads. That's the state's greenhouse, if you will, for life sciences. And this is a place run by, basically very Tea Party.
Hardly a blue state.
Yeah, it's run by Tea Party, very Tea Party friendly governors for the last 9 years. So very fiscally conservative people have come forward with these types of ideas.
Then why did they do it?
Because they know that the growth in high-wage jobs is coming out of these sectors, and that the job growth in some of the traditional sectors like manufacturing tends to be more at the lower end in a lot of ways. Purely distribution and kind of routinized manufacturing. There's some advanced manufacturing sectors that have higher wages, but really where the new jobs had been added in a lot of the Midwest has been in lower wage sectors, retail, and we've seen that happen here as well, where the growth has been in low wage sectors, not high and medium wage sectors. So the idea is to try to boost the production of higher paying jobs, because it's not just about having a job, it's about having a job that allows you to live at a more than a subsistence level.
Right, of course.
And similarly, one of the ideas was create this Rhode Island Institute of Science and Technology to create the labor force to feed these industries. Well, that's an idea. 30 years later, Michael Bloomberg was implementing in New York, where he's partnering with Cornell to put a new engineering school on Roosevelt Island. He said, we want to have a tech industry here. We can't have a tech industry if we don't have the skills. It's similar to how community colleges played an enormously influential role in the rise of Silicon Valley, which really was a manufacturing-based economy with a lot of need for mid-skilled type jobs. And so having the educational infrastructure, it's not just about the elite institutions, about producing kind of the average level talent. So these are things that like very forward-looking people were done. So they were really ahead of their time in a lot of ways.
All right, we got to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk more about the Greenhouse Compact and the lessons it has 30 years later for the still struggling, unfortunately, Rhode Island economy. Stick with us on Executive Suite. Welcome back to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi, and we're taking a little bit more of a historical perspective on the Rhode Island economy this week, looking back at the Greenhouse Compact, that ambitious 1983-84 plan Ira Magaziner famously put together to reboot the economy, spend some public money on that, doing it, and of course was rejected 4-1 by the voters in '84. My guest this week, Renn, economic development expert, a Rhode Island transplant himself of late, and
right.
Aaron and I both recently reread it, and we may have another guest joining us later on, but he is caught in some traffic, so perhaps if we'd invested in the roads and bridges, we could have made it by now here today. One of the striking quotes from the report that I think is very relevant now, and I'm sure would be contested by some people, is this, quote, simply eliminating negatives and making our environment in Rhode Island broadly competitive with those of other states will not provide a sufficient impetus for investment in the state. The absence of negatives will not be enough. Now you think about all the different ideas we have right now. We always are hearing about, what if we cut this tax? What if this regulation is taken away? What if this barrier is removed? And the point they're making is not that those are bad ideas necessarily, but that you can remove all the potential negatives, and yet that still won't necessarily spur new investment. What do you think of that?
Right, you got to have some reason to come in, and the report didn't mince words about the negatives. And there's definitely things about, let's address workers' compensation and other issues that are legitimate structural impediments to business. But just saying we're going to deal with these negatives, but we're not going to give anybody a reason to buy Rhode Island, it's not going to work. And I think when you focus on removing negatives, then you're sort of a little bit saying, well, just take a tax rate, for example. I'm all in favor of lower taxes. But if you're really going to compete on the basis of your tax rate, then you got to start saying things like, well, Texas has no income tax. Tennessee basically has effectively no income tax. So how do you compete? You're basically saying we're going to be in the low-cost business. You're competing with Walmart. Okay, so you've got to be best in class on the negatives in order to do that, because if you're basically saying I'm going to compete on a commodity basis, and you're competing on a commodity basis, you better be the low-cost provider. Since we're never going to be low-cost providers here, the idea is we need to have some positive characteristics as well that are going to induce somebody to want to make a discretionary purchase, if you will, because Rhode Island is always going to be a discretionary purchase.
And Rob Atkinson, who ran a later iteration of this kind of thinking and did his own big report in the 1990s. He's now at a think tank in Washington. He said to me in an interview about a year or two ago, he said, Rhode Island's problem is it has the costs of Minnesota with the services of Mississippi. And that, of course, is an exaggeration. I think he would agree with that. Right. But the point being, you can't charge people for the prices that would make them expect high services without having services that level, or you need to bring your charges down low enough and have them say, well, I'm not paying a lot. Of course, maybe I don't have as many services in Texas.
Right. So I do think cost is an issue. I mean, Rhode Island can't get away with charging too much of a premium, considering there are many broadly similar type of places around the country that have far, far lower price points. So, New York can justify a premium because it's the finance center. People are willing to pay an amazing premium to live and do business in New York, which they leverage and exploit to the max. people are not going to do that in Rhode Island, so I think there has to be the point is you have to pick, a level of service, deliver it cost effectively, and create the right product price bundle, right? Not every car is the same car and the same price on the market. You're targeting different things, you're targeting different demographics, different stages of life. So in our case, it's like target different styling preferences, different industry groups than other people are, where we have some unique attributes that may offer competitive advantage.
And we always talk about those, but I'm curious, from an outsider's perspective, someone who didn't grow up here, what do you see as the advantages that Rhode Island has that should be capitalized on today?
Yeah, I mean, it is like it's kind of difficult, candidly, to say, okay, we've got Harvard and MIT and all these things, but we do have the universities, we do have the coastline. So I think as Lou hit, destination education, the medical sector, extremely good healthcare here. The coast is phenomenal. The second home market here is fantastic, and those people are great because they pay taxes, and you don't have to pay to educate their kids.
Right.
Right. Even if that house is empty, it's still paying taxes. We do have the port down at Quonset, and Quonset Business Park has done very well, and I think it shows the model. When you put the right infrastructure in place from a regulatory and management perspective, Rhode Island can be very attractive. Mm-hmm. I think there are other places in the state where we can do that. We are close to Boston and New York. The amenities of living in New England are quite nice. We have the history. We have a lot of tremendously unique architecture here. And so I think Rhode Island is really, to some extent, focusing on the lifestyle and the location of people who want to live in New England. And we got to make it a basically competitive destination and other things.
One quick thing I want to hit you on that before we go to another break is meds and eds. You mentioned there, education, hospitals. There's been a lot of talk, and I know you've retweeted me writing about it, that there is significant cost pressure on healthcare. There is significant cost pressure in higher education. Brown and Lifespan, our two largest bulwarks in that for Rhode Island, are feeling that pressure. I mean, how much do you think that should be a concern to policymakers right now in Rhode Island?
Well, it obviously should be a concern because the state has basically ridden that horse for a while, and we've seen student loan debt go from next to nothing to $1 trillion in just a decade. Tuition and medical costs have been going up far greater rate than inflation. Everybody and their brother is focusing on these sectors because they've proven very resilient, and you can't, and they're not going to move, right? Brown University's not going to move. You can't sit offshore all the work there to China. So it's easy why people are targeting these sectors, but we're reaching the financial limits. I mean, our healthcare spend as a percentage of GDP in America is out of control. So we have to, I think the limits to growth, we're hitting the limits to growth on those things. Only, truly elite institutions like Brown and RISD are going to have some immunity to that trend. So to the extent that Rhode Island has those types of institutions,
that's where we'll be in good shape. All right, we're going to take another break. When we come back, we'll be joined by Lou Mazzucchelli. He's made it, and we're going to talk some more about the lessons of the Greenhouse Compact. Stick with us on Executive Suite. Welcome back to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi, and pleased to be joined now, along with Renn, who's been with me so far, Lou Mazzucchelli. He is a former technology entrepreneur here, a visiting scholar at Brown University, and he has survived the traffic to make it into us today. And Lou, I want to get right to it because we don't have too much time left. You were actually here, unlike Aaron and I, in the 1980s for the Greenhouse Compact. What do you remember about that time, and what was good and what was bad about that process in the early 80s?
Well, the Rhode Island economy was teetering but not on fire. Ira Magaziner had good credentials as a skilled consultant, very analytical type. We saw the process run as incredibly thorough, and I think Aaron would be the first person to step up and say that. However, there was an element of it's all happening in the back room and it's going to be presented, in full form, which, by the way, got replicated when Ira did the healthcare stuff in the Clinton administration. Okay, so I mean, he didn't change his behavior. That was a real problem because this thing came forth full bloom. Rhode Island wasn't ready to figure it out. It was very complicated. There were systemic solutions to systemic problems, which is really important, but Rhode Island's history has been in doing point solutions to point problems. How can I make Tony feel good about something, right? And not looking at the bigger issues. It understood scale, and scale scared people away. I mean, $250 million for investments in new stuff was the right number then.
And that's in 1982.
That's
$82.
$82. It wasn't a huge tax burden. The financial structure was correct. I mean, we can be glib and say the thing was too hip for the room, but people were not willing to look outside themselves and say, can I see the long-term benefit? The irony, and I'm sure you've noted this, is They set goals for 7 or 8 years. 7 or 8 years passed, and guess what? The state's economy looked a lot like where they wanted it to be through no fault of our own. We just got lucky, okay? And then what happened since 1990, all of the indicators have gone the other way.
And that's where we get to where it really looks like the ugly prescience that this report has in it about what was going to happen to Rhode Island.
Except that, in a way, it's even worse because the demographics of the Rhode Island population are worse now from an employer perspective. Okay, we've got a less skilled workforce. Right. We've got a higher number of immigrants who are a burden on the public trough. Okay, we've got a tax environment that hasn't gotten any better. So the macro environment is worse, and a lot of the prescriptions that come out of something like this, I don't know that they're going to work. And so we can look at this and say, okay, it's going to require this level of analysis, but I also think we're going to have to sort of tilt the board on its side and think of things even differently the next time around. And do we have time is the question.
What did you think when it failed? As someone, you were starting a company then, it was getting started. Did you think, uh-oh, we're in really deep trouble now? Was the writing on the wall and you said, we'll be all right, we'll figure it out?
I was very disappointed, but our business was up and running and we were reasonably successful. But again, we didn't have a lot of friends in our business. We were the lone, there was us and G-Tech was around there, and there wasn't a lot of technology. So we knew we were alone, and we were very disappointed that it didn't look like the state was going to do anything to try and, increase the ranks of guys like us. Beyond that, as a native Rhode Islander, I just sort of went, okay, here's another example of the, I got mine, tough for everybody else mentality.
Very quickly, Lou, and I put this to Aaron before, but the report says very clearly that just eliminating negatives is not enough, which sort of goes to the free market attack on this stuff, which is just lower the taxes, get rid of regulations, and we're good. What do you think of that?
Well, I think those are good things, but I have in front of me here, I try and slice the pie differently. I do this, okay? So instead of saying, okay.
About 30 seconds left.
Got it. There's a group of people here who like to be here and who can afford to be here. And that is where you can build a base of support for any public policy, as opposed to people who like it here but can't afford to be here and who are on the way out, okay, who don't like it here, or who are here because of only public service support. If that group of people goes down, if that group shrinks, we end up
love it and can afford it.
The love it and afford it. We enter a death spiral. Okay, so if you think about tax policy, you think about other kinds of things we can do. Is it going to increase that group or decrease that group? If that group goes below a threshold level, we got a bigger problem on our hands.
Sounds like a good skill to be judging public policy on. All right, well, we can always go on the fly. I want to thank Aaron Renn for playing a little ad-lib with me here, and I want to thank Lou Mazzucchelli for making it and getting this idea in my head to reread the story. We're going to put, again, the full PDF of the Greenhouse Compact Executive Summary on WPRI.com on the page for this episode of Executive Suite, so check it out if you have time, and I'm sure Aaron and Lou will be back once again, hopefully together for the whole show. Thanks for watching. Stick with us next week on Executive Suite.